Picture this, a wall of crimson shields. Moving like a single machine, every sword strike perfectly timed. Every step in unison. That's how we imagine Roman legions conquering the world. But here's the uncomfortable truth historians don't usually advertise. Most Roman soldiers never experienced that perfect formation in actual combat. And when they tried, it often got them killed. The Roman military machine wasn't about perfection. It was about what happened when everything fell apart, and how you survived the chaos that followed. What you're about to discover will completely change how you see ancient warfare, because the real battlefield looked nothing like the history books claim. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with 80 men, packed so tight you can smell the fear on your neighbor's breath. Shields locked in the famous testudo formation, the legendary turtle that supposedly made Roman soldiers invincible. You've trained for this exact scenario hundreds of times in camp, moving as one organism, every legionary knowing his exact position. But here's where it gets disturbing the moment combat actually starts. That beautiful formation begins to disintegrate within seconds. The first javelin volley changes everything. Some of your unit throws their pilum perfectly at 70 feet. Others panic and release early. A few hold too long. The enemy isn't standing still either. They're surging forward in an uncoordinated mass, screaming, weapons flashing in the sunlight. Your centurion is shouting commands, but you can barely hear him over the deafening roar of metal clashing on metal. War horns blaring from every direction. This is the part historians rarely mention. Ancient battles were so loud that communication became virtually impossible after the first 30 seconds of contact. Modern recreations using authentic equipment measured sound levels exceeding 120 decibels, equivalent to standing next to a chainsaw or being at a rock concert. Roman soldiers couldn't hear whistles, couldn't hear orders, couldn't coordinate the neat rotations you see in movies. They fought by instinct, by following whatever movements they could glimpse through the dust and blood spray, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of the formation drilled into their muscle memory. But the enemy knows something crucial that Hollywood never shows you. That perfect shield wall everyone glorifies? It moves at roughly half a mile per hour when maintaining formation integrity. It's breathtakingly slow, making it a sitting target for anyone with ranged weapons or the patience to flank. The testudo formation that supposedly protected legionaries from arrow storms had catastrophic weaknesses, Roman commanders understood all too well. One accurate boulder from a ballista or onager could punch through those overlapping shields and kill a dozen men instantly. Germanic tribes discovered that lighting the shields on fire worked remarkably well. Cavalry charges from the sides could shatter the formation before it had time to pivot, because turning a testudo required coordination that simply didn't exist in the confusion of combat. This changes everything we thought we knew about Roman invincibility. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites across Europe tells a story the ancient propaganda carefully omitted. Skeletal remains show injury patterns inconsistent with organized formation fighting. Sword cuts to the back and sides, crush injuries from being trampled. Defensive wounds on arms suggesting desperate individual struggles rather than the disciplined thrusting from behind shields. Researchers examining the Calgary's battlefield were the Battle of Teutoburg Forest occurred in 09 AD found scattered equipment and remains spread over miles of forest terrain. The physical evidence of formations that didn't just break, they completely dissolved into panic and slaughter. 3 entire Roman legions, roughly 15,000 highly trained soldiers, were wiped out over 3 days, not because Germanic warriors were superior fighters, but because Roman formation tactics became utterly useless in dense forest terrain. Arminius, who had served in the Roman military and understood their doctrines intimately, deliberately chose ground where the Romans couldn't maintain their precious lines. Trees blocked shield walls, mud sucked at their heavy equipment. Narrow forest paths meant columns stretched out, vulnerable and unable to support each other. When ambushed, Roman soldiers trained to fight in organized units found themselves in desperate, one-on-one struggles they weren't prepared for. The archaeological record shows Roman equipment abandoned in panicked retreat, something that would have resulted in severe punishment under normal circumstances, but proves how completely their tactical cohesion shattered. Now here's the midpoint revelation that reframes everything. Roman military superiority was never about maintaining perfect formations during battle. It was about having a system to restore order faster than the enemy after both sides descended into chaos, as every ancient battle eventually became a confused melee where formations disintegrated. The Roman genius was the manipular system that later evolved into the cohort structure, which allowed smaller units to operate independently and reform even after the main line broke. When a cohort got pushed back or overwhelmed, units behind could step in, or fragments could fall back to rally points. The historian Josephus, who watched Roman legions in action during the Jewish wars, observed that their training made confusion look organized, that their battles resembled drills because of how quickly they could transition between order and chaos and back to order. This wasn't about robotic perfection, it was about controlled flexibility. The real Roman advantage was psychological. While their enemies fought in loose tribal formations that depended on individual courage and momentum, Roman soldiers knew that even if the man next to them fell, the system would replace him, reinforce the line, maintain pressure. The soldier in formation wasn't alone. He was part of something larger that could absorb casualties and keep functioning. But this only worked when terrain, circumstances, and enemy tactics allowed it. In forests, mountains, ambushes, against cavalry charges, or facing enemies who refused to engage in conventional set-piece battles. Roman formations became liabilities rather than assets. Persian cataphracts discovered that charging heavy cavalry straight into a Roman shield wall could sometimes punch through by sheer momentum and weight before the Romans adapted their tactics. Parthian horse archers frustrated Roman commanders for generations by simply refusing to close, peppering formations with arrows from beyond javelin, range and retreating whenever Romans advanced. The myth of the unbreakable Roman formation persists because Roman military writers only emphasized their successes and attributed defeats to moral failures, cowardice, or divine disfavor rather than tactical limitations. Modern media perpetuates this because perfectly synchronized shield walls look amazing on screen and fit our desire for order and discipline to triumph over chaos. But actual Roman military manuals and training documents that survive show commanders were obsessed with maintaining discipline, precisely because they knew how easily it collapsed under battlefield stress. Punishments for breaking ranks were severe, including decimation, where every 10th man in a cowardly unit was beaten to death by his comrades. Not because Romans naturally fought in perfect order, but because human nature under extreme stress is to panic, scatter, and flee. The formations had to be drilled and enforced through fear because they went against survival instincts. What modern experimental archaeology has revealed changes the picture even more dramatically. When researchers equipped volunteers with replica Roman gear and had them attempt formation fighting, they discovered that maintaining the tight spacing described in ancient texts is physically exhausting and practically impossible once people start pushing and shoving, the famous 3-foot spacing between soldiers that supposedly allowed sword work meant that once lines met, men naturally compressed together until there was barely room to breathe, let alone execute techniques. The choreographed rotation systems where fresh troops smoothly replaced tired fighters? No archaeological or textual evidence conclusively proves Romans did this in the middle of melee combat. It might have worked between engagements, but during active fighting, the chaos made such coordination nearly impossible. So what's the truth that makes you see Roman warfare completely differently? Roman legions dominated the ancient world not because they fought like machines in perfect formation, but because they trained so obsessively that they could maintain fragments of formation and cohesion, longer than enemies who had no formation discipline at all, against disorganized tribal warriors or the rigid phalanxes of Hellenistic armies. Even a partially functioning Roman tactical system provided enough advantage. But against adaptable enemies using terrain cleverly or employing combined arms tactics, Roman formations failed regularly. The Romans learned from defeats and adapted their training, equipment, and organization constantly. The army that conquered Gaul was different from the one that fought Carthage, which was different from the late Empire forces facing Gothic invasions. The image of unchanging, perfect Roman military discipline is a myth created by selective history. The reality was messier, more human, more improvisational, and ultimately more interesting. Roman soldiers were men who trained hard, feared dying, and did their best to survive when everything became chaos and blood and confusion. Sometimes holding formation just long enough to win, often breaking and running. occasionally achieving moments of coordinated violence that their commanders later turned into legends of perfect discipline. That's the truth Hollywood won't show you. So what myth should we break down next?